Another way to classify hormones is if they're water-soluble or lipid-soluble. Water-soluble hormones are all of the protein hormones and the biogenic amines, with the exception of thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone is a biogenic amine, but it is not water-soluble. So being water-soluble means that they will mix with water. Or in other words, they're hydrophilic. This is important because hormones travel in the blood, and blood is mostly made of water. So with your water-soluble hormones, they have no trouble traveling in the blood. They travel in the blood just fine. Then when they get to the cells, they're going to bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. So in this picture, this is the outside of the cell. This is the inside of the cell. This blue thing here is the receptor. And here, this green triangle is the hormone. So water-soluble hormones will bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. They're going to cause a change inside the cell, though. So you have to have what's called a second messenger. This purple thing here is a second messenger. Notice how it's attached to the receptor. So when the hormone binds to the receptor, this activates the second messenger. That second messenger will then go do one of two things. So in the top picture here, it shows that the second messenger, so just to show you what's in here, here's the hormone. Here's the receptor. Then you activate the second messenger. So these arrows show the second messenger being activated. Here you have an enzyme. The enzyme is inactive or the enzyme is active. The second messenger activates the enzyme. So a second messenger can then activate an enzyme. The bottom picture shows the other thing a second messenger can do. Here is a gate. Think back to chapter 4. Gates let ions in and out of cells. So you can see here extracellular fluid, that's the outside of the cell. Cytosol, that's the inside of the cell. Here's your hormone, here's your receptor, here's your second messenger. When the hormone binds, it activates the second messenger, and then the second messenger goes and opens the gate to let ions in or out. So the other thing a second messenger can do is to open a gate, and you let ions in or out. So to summarize a water-soluble hormone, it will travel in the blood just fine. So it does not need a carrier. because it mixes with the water in the blood. It then binds to a receptor on the surface. This activates a second messenger. And then two things can possibly happen from that second messenger. You can activate an enzyme, or you can open a gate. Now we'll look at lipid-soluble hormones. Lipid-soluble are the steroid hormones, because remember, they are made from cholesterol, and cholesterol is a lipid. And thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is a biogenic amine, but it's lipid soluble. So it's the exception to the rule. So lipids, steroids, are going to be hydrophobic. So this presents a challenge for hormones since they travel in the blood, and blood is mostly water. So they need a carrier in the blood. So in this picture, here is the hormone, the yellow thing, and the blue thing here is the carrier. So the first issue to consider with lipid-soluble hormones is how they travel in the blood. Since they are hydrophobic, they must be bound to a carrier. So while a hormone is bound to a carrier, it is called bound hormone. The carrier is essentially protecting it from touching the water in the blood. At any given time, 90 to 99% of the hormone is bound. So while it's bound, it is protected. But it can't interact with target cells. In order to interact with the target cell, it has to become unbound. So an unbound hormone is released from its carrier. So here you can see it's unbound. This hormone has been released from its carrier, and now it goes to interact with the target cell. So this is our target cell. So at any given time, this is going to be 1 to 10% of the hormone. So the implication of this is that lipid-soluble hormones are basically a slow release. When a gland secretes a lipid-soluble hormone, you get a bunch of hormone into the blood, but most of it is bound. So you get a large amount into the blood, but most is bound. And you slowly, over the course of hours or days, that hormone becomes unbound and interacts with target cells. And it's not all at once, it's only 1 to 10% at a time becomes unbound. So a main difference between lipid-soluble and water-soluble hormones is how long they last. Lipid-soluble will be active for days or hours. And that's because of how it's bound to these carriers. Back up here, the water-soluble, because it does not require a carrier, it's only active for a few minutes. Then let's look at how this hormone interacts with the cell. So remember from back in chapter 4, your cell membrane is lipid. It's all those phospholipids. This hormone is lipid soluble. So you can see here, it passes through the cell membrane, and here is its receptor inside the cell. So lipid-soluble hormone will enter the target cell. And it binds with a receptor inside the cell. This is then called a hormone receptor complex. So this, where the hormone and receptor are bound to each other, is a hormone receptor complex. The purple part here is the nucleus of the cell. So again, think back to chapter 4, the parts you've learned. The hormone receptor complex enters the nucleus. Now think about what's inside a nucleus. Hopefully you remember DNA. The hormone receptor complex binds to DNA. Now if you also think back to chapter 4, DNA codes for protein. And when you go to make a protein, you first have to make messenger RNA, which is a copy of the gene. It then goes out to the ribosome, and it follows those instructions, and you make a protein. So that hormone receptor complex will enter the nucleus. It will bind to the DNA. This stimulates the DNA to transcribe into messenger RNA. The messenger RNA will then go to the ribosome, and the ribosome will translate it into protein. So you end up building a protein. So to summarize, a lipid-soluble hormone results in the cell making a protein. So whenever you have a lipid-soluble hormone, your cell is going to respond by building protein, doing protein synthesis.